Scholars projects. Of course, lunch hour depends where you are on the continent. I know some of you are on the east, and it's now the afternoon, and some of you are in the west like me, and it's the morning. So welcome anyway. And we're going to look at, in this range of seminars, share projects that people are working on with dialogue to discuss methodologies, successes, and challenge various people have encountered in their work. So I hope you'll find this an interesting and stimulating series. In this inaugural session, we'll hear from Linda Ferguson, professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Saskatchewan. And Linda has a strong background in educational research and scholarship and also in rural nursing. And today she'll be sharing with us various challenges and opportunities that she's encountered with working in data repositories in her work related to tracking the employment history of new graduates from the University of Saskatchewan. She's also going to look at the practical implications of using secondary data like this and for the university's nursing program. Linda's going to provide us an overview of her project and how it relates to today's theme, first of all, and then we'll have time for your questions. So to submit a question, there is no audio question response. We're not using participants' mics here. So you'll have to submit your questions using the chat function on your screen. You'll see there's a chat window there, and you can type in a question or comment there and then hit enter. So please use the chat function on your screen, and you can add a question at any time during the seminar. I'll be tracking them, and I'll collate them and ask them at the end in order. But when you finish typing your question, don't forget to hit the send button, otherwise we won't see it. So now I'll turn the session over to Linda so we can begin. Linda, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Bernie. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about one aspect of nursing education research, and probably an underutilized aspect of nursing education research, and that's the use of data repositories in nursing education. One of the things that we know is that policymakers respond very well to findings that come from data sources and that can be demonstrated to either support the need for something or the effectiveness of something. And so looking at the use of that data is a really important thing to do in any area of research, but nursing education in particular, because we haven't justified a lot of our decisions in the past using data. So I'm presenting based on some work that we've done at the University of Saskatchewan since 2002, looking at data management and the use of data analysis, primarily looking at our students, their progress through the program, their demographic information, and then where they choose to work and the for that particular kind of employment. So the purpose of database research, first of all, is just to substantiate many of the decisions that we're making. It's important to recognize that when you use databases, your research and any publication arising from it require a research ethics board's approval. However, a lot of the decisions that we're addressing and using databases to address are actually program evaluation, quality improvement kinds of investigations. And generally, these don't require an ethics review because they're internal to the program. And so it's important to differentiate very clearly how and why you're going to use the data, and therefore what processes you need to go through. One of the primary purposes, of course, is for program assessment, and is what we are doing actually effective? And we do have a few sacred cows in nursing education, and we do try to demonstrate that some of our sacred cows actually, based on our clinical judgment and our assessment of outcomes, is in fact, they are in fact very useful. But in other instances, faculty time and student times are often consumed in some processes that may not be as effective as we hope they are. We also are looking at research purposes, and our database is just an excellent example of some of the research that can be obtained through databases. And lastly, for publication, And you may find that program evaluation often involves answering questions that we as nurse educators want answered about our programs, but also answering questions that other nurse educators may be interested in as well. And so again, if there's a possibility of presentation or publication looking outward to enhancing the knowledge of the discipline, I would encourage as well getting ethical approval so that you could proceed to that process if you so choose. Now, the most accessible database to most nurse educators is the student records database within the program. And as you might expect, people are very, very sensitive about the data that they hold about students within the program. And so although it's accessible, it also has to be managed in a very ethical manner. And so it's important that that kind of information be accessed with everybody fully informed that it is being accessed. So if it is a student database of grades and admission data that's collected when they apply for the program, it's important that the department approve your access to that data and recognize what your intent is. And most of the time the intent is to answer questions that we as educators have about our own programs, about the quality of our programs, and how to improve outcomes for the students within those programs. So the purpose has to be very clear. It is important to recognize that many of the nurse educators in Canada now are in partnerships with other institutions, and institutions are understandably very reluctant to release data to other institutions. And so if one is in partnership, often it is important to acknowledge that reluctance and ensure that one is dealing with it in a very open, transparent, and ethical manner. So student confidentiality is obviously very, very important to all of us. And the fact that we are in fiduciary relationships with our students, and as such, we're in a power-over relationship. And so when we ask for consent from students, that we do so with a recognition of that power and try to reduce that power by involving RAs or some other individual who's not directly related with the proposed quality improvement or research project. We do find that when students come into the programs, they provide a very minimal amount of data to us. And at my own institution, it's things like location, where they took their high school, age, marital status, dependents, their Aboriginal status, which is very important to us in Saskatchewan. I'm trying to think. It's very minimal at any rate. And we can use that data that's been provided, but again, that is confidential data. And so when we use that data, we like to do so with the knowledge of the students. And so if we're doing quality improvement, we can go ahead and use the data that's been provided to us as part of the quality improvement without getting student consent. But if we're going to use it for research purposes, we often go back to the students and ask their consent to use that very limited amount of data. The thing that we find probably the best way to go about it is to ask the students to provide the data to the researchers directly rather than trying to get it out of, say, our university database. And again, many of our students are very willing to do so. What we also do when we're looking at using database research is creating new databases. And again, the institutions are very reluctant to have what they consider to be shadow databases. And so these are often databases that are used for research purposes or quality improvement purposes, but they're often called a dead or a terminal kind of database in that they're not going to feed back into the system. And those shadow databases worry our ICT people because they're concerned about the possible corruption of their data, which of course is a very realistic concern. So creating new databases often means we import data from the institution's database with their permission and with all of the ethical approvals and department approvals, and I think everybody on God's earth has to approve. Nonetheless, that's the important part of going through the process. The creation of the new database is often importing that data so that it can be available for analysis, and then adding the additional data into that. So what we have done is added into our existing database on student grades and whatnot an exit survey where we in fact ask students for additional demographic information and things like life events that have occurred while they've been in the program, things about their motivations for employment, and where they in fact have had employment. And it has been exceedingly useful to find out that many of our students have employment confirmed within the last 2 weeks of their programs. In the study that we did, we also decided that we would do follow-up employment surveys. So in addition to the data about the student while he or she was in the program, including things like grades, clinical placements, etc., we asked for additional data at exit, and then we also asked them if we had permission to contact them 2 years following their graduation from the program and 4 years following graduation from the program. And again, the students were very open when we explained the purpose of the database we were creating and what we wanted to do with that information. Now again, we obtained student consent, and students being what students are, there can be transitory, and so we've often asked them for not only their university email contact, which some of them do use on a continuing basis, and at our institution they have it for life. They have their USask email address for life. But we also ask them for another contact email, because frequently they have Gmails or Hotmails that they use more frequently. We found that most of the students provided us with that kind of contact information, but we also made arrangements to use the alumni databases to contact them, and the students tend to update that contact information. So again, we had ethical approval to use the alumni databases for contact as well. Other ways of creating contact information is through the professional regulatory associations. And again, they're very careful with their data. And so usually there's a fee involved, and also that they will send out to their members rather than give the researcher the names of their members. And so often you will find contact directly from the graduates, etc. We have tried Facebook contact and searching on Facebook, and again, that has been very, very interesting. And the one part that we've not been very successful about is getting information about the NCLEX, of course, which is the exit database that we might want to know more about, and have contact or have information from our students and our graduates about their success on the NCLEX. And right now, the only success we have is going on and doing a nurse search on the regulatory body, and all we can tell is whether or not the student has passed. And again, that just requires individual student or graduate search for every single name, and all we know is yes or no. If you are doing research and you're trying to use external databases, it's challenging. Not impossible, but it's challenging. And again, you need ethical approval from your own institution, but you also need ethical approval from the REB of the institution that you might be accessing the data from, or if you're going to be doing any kinds of searches or surveys of their faculty or students. You will be given limited, well, you won't be given access, but you'll be given limited access to the data you request and have ethical approval for. And so you really have to be very thoughtful in exactly what you're going to need. They will limit what they provide only to the requested and approved, ethically approved data. And you can't go into their databases and fish. They will give you what they request, what you request, and nothing more, even if they might think that something else would be useful to you. And it's also interesting as well that CASN provides some very useful information in aggregate or summarized form, which might provide the context for some of the information you're finding at your local schools. And that would consist of things like numbers of students, graduates, programs that students are taking, and that type of thing. So as a comparison for the assessments you're doing within your own programs. If you're trying to collect data from other schools that you might import into your database, again, it's important to recognize that they probably will not give you access to raw data. They might give you aggregate data, or they might allow you access to their students or their faculty. But it's important to recognize that, again, data is sensitive, and I'm going to give you some illustrations later on of why it's sensitive. And so therefore, you will find data collected from other schools. Again, absolutely you have to have ethical approvals. And if you send emails requesting people to participate in a study or to add information that you're going to incorporate into a database, on the email itself, provide information on the ethical approvals. And I just received a request yesterday for some research that somebody was doing, and you had to go into the questionnaire to find out if they had ethical approval or not. So again, the kinds of ethical approval are really, really important when you're doing research. And the CNA data will tell you about things like numbers of students and faculty, types of programs, the graduates from the different types of programs, qualifications of faculty, and this information has been submitted by the schools. So it's direct information, but again in aggregate rather than the individual persons. And so if you want individual data, you would have to go to those schools and search or invite participation and incorporate it in that way. Now, an example of what we did at the University of Saskatchewan was a database to track the progress of students and their employment history and work practice over a period of 5 years after graduation. And that was prompted by so many questions such as, do BSN nurses actually stay in clinical practice? Are the nurses we graduate from programs in this province staying in this province? Are some of the initiatives that the government had implemented to encourage students to stay in the Saskatchewan workforce actually effective in doing so? And then the clinical placements that we in fact provide to students, do they have an impact on where students choose to work after their programs? So this particular database originated in 2002. It was jointly managed by the partners of the Nursing Education Program of Saskatchewan. And we had just one single program in Saskatchewan between SIAST, the Saskatchewan Institute of Applied Sciences and Technology, and that's now the Sask Polytech, and also the College of Nursing at the University of Saskatchewan, which had sites in 3 different places within Saskatchewan at that time. So it was managed at the University of Saskatchewan, maintained at the University of Saskatchewan, which is a big political question. And where do you maintain the data in a partnership program such as this? And this program was jointly managed. The data came from one institution to another institution and it was stored at the second institution's website type of thing, so or network. So it was a very interesting process. And initially it started out just as the grades of students and tracking the minimal amount of data we had, and then employment with data was added in 2002. To show you how important that kind of data is to policymakers, it was jointly funded by the College of Nursing and SciAST, as you might expect, but we also received a fairly large grant annually from the Sask Health, the Health Human Resources branch of Sask Health, $15,000 a year. The Saskatchewan Registered Nurses Association, the union in the province, and then a third partner joined us, which was First Nations University of Canada. And so all of these partners provided funding to support this database, which answered many of their questions. And it was powerful in answering those questions, and so the funding continued over a 15-year period of time. That particular database was to provide evidence upon which to make program and curricular decisions. And we did find that data that was within the institutional databases was not available for us to manipulate and analyze. And therefore, we created a shadow database that was inert, inactive, and separate from the institutional databases. And that's where the data from SciAST resided within the university. But it was set up and maintained on our network. So it was maintained here with the goodwill of SciAST, I must admit, because that's a very challenging question. We did recognize that over that period of time, our students were changing. And with the addition of a new partner, First Nations University of Canada, again, we had changing demographics. We know, as does everybody, that we have program issues, challenges, problems, things that are not functioning as we had anticipated, hoped, or planned. And so we wanted to know what they were, and sometimes you need the data to help you identify that. And then secondly, when we made changes in our program to try to address some of those issues, were they effective in changing the outcomes? And again, data would tell us that. And then, again, to answer some of the questions about work, RN work history, where they went, where students as graduates went, and why, and also to address some of the faculty questions and misconceptions. And interestingly enough, we have a number of misconceptions as faculty. Now, the database that we finally created had admission data, additional demographic information from the exit survey. We had course, progress, and clinical placement data. At the exit survey on graduation, we asked a lot of life experiences kinds of questions. And these were things that we do know have impact on student progress, but sometimes that information is very sensitive from a student perspective, and they don't want it stored in the institution or may never provide it to the institution. We then had a 2- and 5-year survey of them following graduation, and we did have some links to other databases. And we got from those databases information on clinical placements. And one of the databases we did use was HSPNet, and again, had great challenges in getting that information, but finally did. And so people did provide the information appropriately. So this was a fairly complex database, and this is what it looked like. And all of the databases were linked so that we could correlate various aspects to outcomes. And so as confusing as it looked, it then did require somebody with database knowledge to assist me in managing the databases and pulling up the various variables that we might use in analysis. We did have ethical approval, and again, we got all of this information from usually the students, the institutions, or manual entry. And then we did engage a company to survey our students, our graduates, using a telephone and online survey so that the students had the choice of completing the survey online or to have somebody ask them the questions by telephone. And our response rates have been anywhere from about 58% to 70% of our graduates. So we had a very good confidence interval because of the percentage of participants. And then Insightrix, again, would make that data available to us for incorporation into our database. We did have additional information such as experience in healthcare, family demographics. We are very interested in Saskatchewan about the number of Aboriginal students that we have, and also previous post-secondary information. And then we wanted to know if we had students that were experiencing significant life changes. And this is quite a phenomenal list. This is from 1 year on exit, and these are the things that students reported as significant life changes during their course of time within the program. And it didn't necessarily say whether they took 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years to complete, but nonetheless, these were significant changes. And when we do correlate progress, of course, that has impact. We wanted to know if our students were working. And with today's high cost of education, we did find over a period of a number of years that, yes, they were working. And when we looked at how much were they working, we found that the median hours that they were working were, in first year, 16 hours a week, and in fourth year, 12 hours a week. And that in any given year, at least half of the students were working on average 16 hours a week. And that has implications, again, for our student body. And so particularly with clinicals and whatnot, a fairly demanding program, this was very interesting to know. We also have student assistant experiences for the students after their third years, between third year and fourth year, and during fourth year, and that about half of our students were working in that capacity. We do see a lot of benefit for that information, or for that kind of experience, and many of the students talked about how important it was for their development within the hospital milieu, because most of them were hospital-based. And secondly, it contributed to their likelihood of getting a job on their very same units. And we did find that 3/4 of our students got employment on the units on which they were employed as student assistants. So do we support that program? You bet. However, we also found that faculty perception was that employment limits success in the program. And so that was one of the questions we wanted to answer. And what we did do is look at the number of students that were working and their progression through the program. And the very interesting thing was that there were no correlations between the number of hours worked and their success, or the number of hours they worked per week and their length in the program. Now that was a faculty misconception as it's turned out, and so faculty were advising students that they should in fact not work. And it's a reality for many of our students now that they have to. We did note that there was a decrease in the number of hours worked over the 4 years of the program, and that related to the demands of the program. So faculty, when they saw this evidence, concluded that perhaps they didn't need to be quite so concerned and that students were able to manage their work commitments as well as manage their student commitments. We wanted to know how many of our students received bursaries or scholarships, and this was at a time when the government was providing what came to a tuition bursary for fourth year. And so 3/4 of our students were receiving bursaries or scholarships, which again was a surprise to many of our faculty. And we also know that many of our students had student loans. And the student loans are a very important feature because we were able to speak to government about the size of those loans and the recognition of the fact that the students wanted to be paying off those loans. As a result of some of this information, the government has instituted a tax credit for some of the loans. They changed some of the loans into bursaries with service such that they would be forgiven over time, and in fact used this information as ways of perhaps keeping the students within the province. And when we did our follow-up studies, we found that immediately on graduation, 97% of our students are employed within the province, and in these particular years, our employment rates were 100%. And we're looking at that time, about 300 students in the program. So we're looking at a fairly large number of graduates. One of the questions that did come up is, should we admit students with high school grade averages between 65 and 69? There was an observation among among faculty that these were the students who floundered in post-secondary education. And so the admission average was examined in terms of the progress of our students. What we did find is that the students that had other post-secondary still had a success rate only of 60.5%. And we really can't explain that because we would have expected post-secondary students to have been far more successful than that. Now this was the 1996 to 1999 admissions, given their 7 years, would have gone through to 2006 in terms of assessing their outcomes. We do know that special admission students had fairly high failure rates. And the interesting thing was the students who came out of high school with the 70 to 79% averages had the highest failure rates overall. And can we explain that? No, I'm afraid not. One of the things we do know is that there had been a lot of inflation in the grades over time from the high schools. And so high school graduations rates were inflating during that period of time. It was quite a significant grade inflation in order to support students getting into post-secondary. So whether that accounts for it, we really don't know. As a result of some of this data, the decision was made not to admit students from high school with averages between 60 to 69 at the University of Saskatchewan. However, they could come in with special admissions, which usually required them to take 2 or 3 post-secondary courses and demonstrate their acceptability for further post-secondary on those courses. Now, this is an attrition rate at that time of 26%. And that did concern us in this program overall, because that means that literally 1 out of 4 of our students are not successful in the program. We have a large number of Aboriginal students, and so one of the questions arose is the students who are being admitted under our equity program, are they in fact at greater risk? The faculty thought that the male students were at greater risk, etc. In the meantime, we also put into place some programs to support students, including tutoring for the high-risk courses, which we identified through our database, the high failure rate courses, and also those individuals at higher risk for failure. And what we did do is identified where the attrition occurred throughout the program. And as you can see, this was a direct entry program, and the highest attrition rates were in first year. And again, individuals coming directly out of high school, perhaps with grades on average at that time of 85% plus, but coming into post-secondary and having a significant amount of difficulty. So we looked at the progression rates and determined that it was first year where we needed to provide additional supports. We also recognized that a number of students, in fact, do have what we call deferred progression, where they may have missed some courses in their first year, but they actually do complete over time. And so we found that those who completed in 4 years was 57%, but many students required 5 years for completion. And a recognition that we do allow students to go on part-time. So, who were the students who attrited? And we looked at one of the faculty misconceptions that in fact the male students were unsuccessful at a more significant rate. And in fact, that wasn't true. The attrition may have had delayed progression, but in fact, there was no difference in the attrition rate over time. And 2001, we really couldn't explain why there was such a high attrition rate after the 6 years, and we didn't have the 7th year included in there. But we do know that most of our students complete in the 1 year after the 4-year usual program completion. So faculty were wrong. The male students were not at greater risk. How about the students who were admitted by equity? And again, their rate was higher, but non-significant for the 1996 cohort. However, when we looked at the year 2000 and 2001, there were very significant differences, and our equity program was targeted at Aboriginal students. And seeing that they are in fact being admitted with lower averages than the other students, but that they are also unsuccessful at a higher rate than the other students, which does logically go together. But the social justice aspect of it is if you admit people to an equity program, you have to provide the supports as well to help them compensate for the disadvantage that they are at. And so at that time, we then put in some support programs for all the students, but primarily targeted at the equity students. And we have been quite successful in reversing this trend and also recognizing that the programs were successful. We've continued them. To this day, we continue them. And in 2014, we graduated 54 Aboriginal nurses in the year 2014. And that's in 1 year. So the programs are very successful. We maintain the programs, and our graduation rate among our Aboriginal students is no different than the other students. We've also reduced our attrition rate overall to about 14% with a variety of other programs we've put into place. The other thing we noted is that we had a little problem with clinical grade inflation. And what we found is that the theory courses, which are Nursing 300 on this slide and Nursing 302, had averages in usually the high 60s, low 70s, which is quite usual for our theory courses. But when we looked at our clinical courses, the averages were usually significantly higher. The other thing that we looked at is when the student had a grade in theory within a certain range, we looked at their corresponding grade in clinical. And in some instances, we had students with theory grades in the 50 to 60 grade, and grades in their clinical within the 80 to 90 range. And what that said to us is there's got to be some kind of disconnect here, where in fact our clinical teachers are not assessing the knowledge that the student had in practice. And because of that, we actually went back and changed our orientation of our clinical faculty. We put in place a clinical conference where we discuss a lot about clinical evaluation. And we tried to address this disconnect between, on this slide, the range between the theory course in the mauve color and the range in the clinical course in the burgundy color. And so what we ended up was trying to make these a little more consistent. What we did find as one of the bases for this is our clinical teachers not understanding the clinical criteria for assessing clinical grades. And so we were getting very, very high clinical grades, which perhaps the students hadn't quite earned. We looked at impact, and we tracked the changes that we made within the program and maintained those programs that were in fact effective and got rid of the ones that weren't working for the most part. We still continue to do some things that we have had difficulty tracking, such as the journals and logs that our students spend a great deal of time on. We have been able to advocate with government. They were very concerned and perhaps had received some information from the Psychiatric Nursing Association that the registered nurses in our program were not receiving psychiatric nursing experience. And so we were able to explain that in our 4th year, in our practicum experience, the students, in fact, 19% of our students had clinical placements in psychiatric facilities. We could respond to policy decisions at both the government level and at the university level, and to be able to provide evidence to support our response. So it's not just saying we think, but in fact we have the evidence to support that if you implement a policy, for instance, to give all of the available hours to the more senior people in the workplace, that our brand new graduates, about 50% of whom were part-time or casual, would in fact not get the work they needed to pay off those high student loans. And the government actually backed off that particular legislation, and I think our feedback was probably part of the response they got. In terms of BSNs at the bedside, 5 years into practice, we still have 85% of our BSNs at the bedside. We keep 97% of our nurses, even 5 years into practice, in Saskatchewan. We've responded to the available hours legislation and could confront that misconception with evidence to show that that would in fact harm our graduates and in fact harm the government, because those graduates they had helped pay to educate would in fact go to Alberta, where the salaries at that time were higher. We've used that information for program approval and accreditation, and it's very strong data. We have used it to support government incentives that have been to the advantage of our students. And we've been able to respond to the media with evidence and respond to possible criticisms of our program with actual evidence to confront some of the misconceptions. So we basically have found the database to be very, very useful. It can be used for research, and we've published reports. It can also be used for quality improvement and to support some of the situations such as approval and accreditation where you do need data to support some of the decisions that you're making. We do recognize that as the database becomes more complex, we often will need the assistance of a technician in order to support the analysis of that information. But nonetheless, it's very, very useful information that has answered a lot of our program questions. And I think I'll leave it at that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. That was a really interesting presentation, and we've had some good questions submitted during your slides, which I'll be happy to relay to you.
Okay.
For the rest of the audience, if you've got other questions out there, please feel free to contribute them now. I'll do them in order, and so all you need to do is type them in your chat window at the bottom and click the Submit key. So the first question I had was from Ryan, who asked, what kind of tools are used for all this data collection? Is this an in-house software or something like SurveyMonkey?
Actually, we have had Paperbase because we find that is actually the best way to get data from students. So on exit, they meet with their faculty, and we've had that information collected at that time. So there's two forms. One is the data that we're asking them to submit, like life events. And then the second information that we ask them to provide is the contact information for employment surveys 2 and 5 years after graduation. We do have this information submitted in manila envelopes, so if anybody chose not to fill it out, they can put the paper-based information uncompleted back into the envelope and hand an envelope in, and their teachers will never know whether they've agreed to participate or not. Our data collection has been almost 100% at that point. If we have used SurveyMonkey or any other online data collection other than the Insightrix company that collects information for us, we found the response rate to be about 20%. And that just wouldn't give us the power to actually answer the questions we wanted. Within the program, we downloaded the information into Excel for manipulation, analysis, etc. And it's usually within Excel you can do the kinds of correlations and whatnot that are most useful. It's also something that faculty can become quite adept at using, and it may not be the easiest program to work with, but with the large data, it has worked for us.
Excellent, thank you very much. Another question from Anita. Could you give us an example of faculty misconceptions? And I know you mentioned a couple, so perhaps what were the key faculty misconceptions you came across?
Well, the working misconception was a big one, and faculty were trying to advocate with students not to work, and of course it wasn't working. The other was about the male students, and the third big one was about our Aboriginal students, and they were concerned that in fact those students were at greater risk, and our research showed that in fact yes, they were. The program that was put in place involved hiring individuals to support them through tutoring the difficult classes, and in this instance one of the gatekeeper classes was the anatomy and physiology class, supporting them through that particular class with tutors, but also a recognition of the large number of social events that a number of our Aboriginal students were coping with. And when we started to realize that I think it was 70% of our Aboriginal students had dependents, whereas our regular stream students, I believe, and those were students entering through the equity program, the other students, I think it was about 20% had dependents. And that's a large difference in terms of some of the social things that the students are coping with. And so again, there were resources put in place, including some of our alumni committing scholarships that would help some of the students who had dependents and who were working along with that to try to pay for their education. So those were some of the big ones. We also had people who insisted that because nursing was the students' majors, then they should get very high marks in the clinical courses. But when we were able to provide information on how much of a disconnect there was between a student who's getting a D in, or almost failure in her knowledge base, and an A in her clinical practice, that really points out to us that there's either a misapplication of the liberal descriptors, which very carefully and very clearly point out the knowledge of the student and application to practice, or that people were using those literal descriptors inappropriately in assessing the students, or they weren't actually assessing the knowledge base. And so we provided more information to our sessional faculty who are working with the students in the clinical setting. And it has reversed to a certain extent, but there still is some disconnect, just not so marked. And we are more likely now to catch the students who have very, very low theory knowledge. They're not getting the really high grades now in clinical. And to be quite honest, our clinical teachers do not know what their marks are in their academic courses. So they are asking the questions that demonstrate whether or not the student has the knowledge that they should be applying in practice.
Thanks.
So those are some of the key ones.
That's great. And I've got another question from Jane here, which was, did you experience any problems getting access to some of the data, as with some of it was probably seen as quite sensitive, such as the attrition or NCLEX or failure statistics?
Yes, and as you can imagine, attrition is a very sensitive information, and I very clearly provided you with very old attrition data because it does not reflect our current program. Because this information goes public, and attrition is a very sensitive thing. Our current attrition rate is in the realm of about 14%, and we also recognize that students do in fact have 6 years for completion of our program, and we do recognize that the student who takes 5 years is often a student who's either gone part-time, had a life event, or has had difficulty with the class which they've had to repeat. And a recognition that people can make mistakes and still be very good nurses over time if they correct those omissions. And so that was some of the information that was difficult to obtain. Student information, social information is very, very sensitive. And I do suspect we had a lot of that information in our student advisor files, which was not available to us and would not be made available to us. And that's why we had to ask for that information on exit, when the students would not fear that that information might jeopardize their progress within the program. And in some instances...
And Ryan asked as well, how was clinical placement data obtained? Was that easy to obtain?
No. There are two ways of obtaining it, and one is that we certainly know within our own program where the students are placed, but that would have been more laborious to obtain. We obtained that through HSPNet, which is the organization that does the clinical placements between the agencies and the educational institutions. And that was seen as a more expedient way of getting the information. That probably took me about 18 months to get permission to obtain. And interestingly enough, and at one point I said, you realize, of course, that I can obtain this information within my program, but it is more expedient to obtain it from HSPNet and to have that information fed in every year rather than going through this same laborious, painful process every year. And finally, that permission was granted, and then they just transferred the information to us. But institutions and agencies are notoriously very careful, as they should be, with their data, their student contact information, and anything about the students. So you just have to persist in accessing that information.
Sure, and Anita just asked, could you repeat or summarize again the findings on the data from high school students and grades? Because we went through that quite quick, and that was a very interesting point.
I don't know if I can go back to that slide. I don't think so. But what we, at that time, the average admission from high school was 85% or higher. And at that point, we also admitted close to 700 students throughout the province. And it's interesting that we had so many students throughout the province who had averages over 85%. And we had seen our admission average increasing every year. Now, we had probably at that time a 3 to 4 applicant per position for the province-wide program, so within the whole of Saskatchewan. When students were coming directly from high school, what we recognized is that students who'd graduated 10 years earlier were not part of this average inflation that was hitting in about 2005, 2006. And so the older students, the mature students, were often disadvantaged because they had averages that were significantly lower than the new students coming out of high school. When we talked about the attrition rate for those various ranges, we did find that the 80 and 90% students did fairly well. And attrition comes about for many reasons, sometimes social reasons, but also there were students that would come into the program, because it was direct entry, that in fact students would find out that nursing was not as they had expected, and so they would withdraw based on that. In that slide, it did indicate that there were about 26 students where we had no idea why they withdrew. We just lost them, couldn't access them. So basically, when we looked at that slide, we did know that people with lower averages, in fact, had greater problems within the program. And that also recognized that we had an equity program that allowed people with lower averages to exit. And many of them did have averages within the 70 to 79 range, which may explain why that range group had the higher number of failures at the time.
Excellent, thanks. That's very helpful. It's clarified that. I've got time for one more question, which I'm going to give from Cindy, who was sort of looking at the disparity between the clinical and the theory grades, and she asked, is there any effort to account for differences in those who aren't affected by test anxiety or other testing issues, who might be better at application than hands-on work? So possibly the difference between those who are more sort of practically inclined rather than theoretical. Was there any way to account for that?
No, we couldn't account for it. The students will frequently say that, but in fact, when some of our clinical teachers started assessing the knowledge levels of those students, they didn't have the knowledge to underpin their practice. So as much as they might be able to do a glucose testing, they couldn't explain what the range meant, or they couldn't explain what the finding meant and didn't know what the normal range was. So there was evidence that the knowledge deficit noted in the academic course, in fact, when they started questioning, was also evident in clinical practice. So, and that's not everybody, because we couldn't tell if there was test anxiety, but we do have student supports where those students who do have test anxiety are in fact given more time to write and in a separate session. So.
Thanks, that's brilliant. So I think that's it. We've run out of time. Unfortunately, there were some great questions. So first of all, I'd like to thank you again, Linda, for your participation today and a very interesting presentation. Thank everyone who participated and submitted questions. It was a great audience. And note that when this meeting closes, you'll be sent a short evaluation survey about the session. And it shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes to complete. And we'd really like to get your opinion for planning future sessions. So if you fill that in shortly, that would be really helpful. Finally, the recording of this session will be made available via the CASN's YouTube channel. You can Google that or just go on YouTube and you'll be able to find the CASN if you channel there, and you'll be able to get a recording of the whole presentation there. So thanks again, everyone, and CASN certainly hopes you will consider attending the next session, which is on Wednesday, October the 12th. And so we'll hopefully see you there. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.